Support for Ben Franklin's World comes from the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture. Barbara Oberg is a historian and documentary editor. She's worked on the papers of Thomas Jefferson at Princeton and the papers of Benjamin Franklin at Yale. Today, she serves as chair of the Omohundro Institute's executive board, which is a body that helps manage the institute and its resources. Barbara loves working for the OI and serving on its executive board. Her passion for the organization and its work radiates from her voice. In fact, I think you can hear her smiling as she relates what she enjoys most about her work with the OI.
One of the best parts of serving as chair is being an ambassador, both for the Omohundro and for historical scholarship in general, I think. Sometimes I have to explain to people that the Omohundro Institute for Early American History and Culture is not a closed or elite organization just for academics and scholars. We also reach out to people who love history, to secondary school teachers, to public historians, because we want to convey our excitement about the past to a broad range of people. And we've done that since our founding in 1943, I think. We also thought that it was important to share the results of our scholarship through the book program and through the William and Mary Quarterly, and now, of course, through the digital world. So one of the most, I think, exciting projects that we're now involved in are the podcasts, Doing History. We're thrilled at the success of these podcasts and the astounding number of people they are reaching. So we're continuing to grow. We're reaching more and more people. We've got exciting things happening on the podcasts, and I think this is central to our mission. If I meet somebody and they say, how would I start finding out about the Omohundro? I say, go to our website. And there you will have a feast of possibilities to further your interest.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 123 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. In episode 112, which was the first episode in our new Doing History to the Revolution series, we spoke with Mary Beth Norton, a historian who uncovered new details about the tea crisis of 1773. And one of the new details that Mary Beth uncovered was the story of the William, a Boston-bound tea ship that wrecked off the coast of Cape Cod. Now, the William's wreck precipitated a crisis, because unlike in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, the English East India Company's tea landed on American shores in Cape Cod. And as Mary Beth revealed, the landing of the William's tea confirmed the fears of patriots like Samuel Adams, who worried that if the East India Company's tea landed, their fellow colonists would find a way to justify paying the tea tax, a tax that Parliament imposed without colonial consent. And if the colonists paid the tax, then the Patriots' powerful and forceful protests against parliamentary taxation could really be harmed. Now, Mary Beth's insights about the Cape Cod Tea Crisis also revealed that the people of Massachusetts, who we often read about and see portrayed as firebrand revolutionaries, were far from united in their support for the revolution. And this observation raises questions. If the people of radical Massachusetts were far from united in their support for the revolution, how much support did the revolution have? How many Americans truly supported the Patriot cause? As the mission of the Doing History to the Revolution series asks, not just what is the history of the American Revolution, but what are the histories of the American Revolution, it seemed reasonable to devote our second preview episode to an exploration of political allegiances and loyalties during the American Revolution. In this episode, we'll speak with 4 scholars about political allegiance during the Revolution so that we can find out how contemporaries like John Adams viewed the Revolution and what they had to say about Patriots and Loyalists, why it's so hard for us to know how many people supported the Revolution, and what the Revolution meant for Native Americans and people of African descent and their political allegiances. Are you ready to go off to the Revolution? Let's get started. Our search for an answer as to how many Americans supported the American Revolution begins with David Ramsey's The History of the American Revolution in 2 volumes, which is one of the very first histories of the American Revolution. Published in 1796, Ramsey wrote his history using materials collected in the years 1782, 1783, 1785, and 1786, which were years he served as a member of Congress and had access to all the official papers of the United States. Plus, Ramsey lived through and participated in the Revolution, so I thought surely he must have something to say about Americans' revolutionary allegiances. I began with Ramsey's index. I looked for references of Loyalists and then found an editorial note to look under the heading of Tories, where I discovered that Ramsey only sparingly mentions Tories in his history. He references them when he discusses people who evacuated New York with the British, and to describe how the words Whigs and Tories came into use after the Boston Port Act of 1774 went into effect, which was the act that Parliament passed to coerce the colonists of Massachusetts to pay for the tea they destroyed in December 1773. Now, about the terms Whigs and Tories, Ramsey writes that the terms were used, quote, as the distinguishing names for parties. By the former, Whigs, were meant those who were making a common cause with Boston and supporting the colonies in their opposition to the claims of Parliament. By the latter, Tories, those who were at least so far favorers of Great Britain that they wished either no measures or only palliative measures should be adopted in opposition to her schemes, end quote. Great. Ramsey tells us that there existed people who supported different political ideologies, but he doesn't really deal with them in his text, nor does he answer the question of how many people supported each revolutionary ideology. Realizing that I hit this mini roadblock, I turned to Sarah Giorgini, series editor for the Papers of John Adams at the Massachusetts Historical Society, because somewhere in the back of my brain, I had stored the idea that John Adams once said that you could best understand the political allegiances of the American Revolution by dividing Americans into thirds. Sarah, I'd like to chat a bit about John Adams. Now, as a series editor of the Papers of John Adams, you're well-versed in Adams and all the material he wrote. So, what do the Papers of John Adams tell us about the American Revolution and where Adams stood on the imperial crisis?
I want to say a little bit about how John Adams experienced the revolution, because when it broke out in earnest, he was a 40-something father of 4, and he was this Boston area lawyer who was already known for emphasizing the legal ramifications and the constitutional importance of seeking independence from Britain. We know this because he kept a diary, and like a lot of well-educated 18th century citizens, he also kept up a steady stream of correspondence about what was going on around him with the revolution. And we're fortunate enough to hold about 250,000 of those manuscript pages of Adams' family documents at the Massachusetts Historical Society. So let me say something about John Adams' letters and what they say about his avid support and his candid criticism of the American cause, because the sense we have of the revolution is that it is a messy, unfolding epic day to day in his letters. And on the page, John Adams he's blunt, he's brusque. And if you think about the fact that his mail was often intercepted and even printed against his will in the days of the Continental Congress, he's rather brave in setting out what he thought there. And I think one of the things that we really see in his letters is that for a guy who's called the Atlas of Independence, he takes a few intellectual hard turns as the revolution progresses from what he says is the hearts and minds of the people into a really costly all-out war. And so one of the letters that always jumps out to me is a letter he writes to Abigail in the spring of 1775. It's shortly after the battles of Lexington and Concord. And his family lives in Quincy, which is about a half-day's ride from the heart of Boston's fiery political activity. He really has the revolution right on his doorstep, but he's not there. He's away at Congress. Abigail is home supervising the farm. And this is nerve-wracking for him. He thinks of the severe trials that lie ahead, and he tries to imagine a better outcome for his family and friends. And this remarkable letter that he mentions, he writes it to Abigail on May 2nd, 1775, and he says, "In a cause which interests the whole globe, at a time when my friends and country are in such keen distress, I am scarcely ever interrupted in the least degree by apprehensions for my personal safety. I'm often concerned for you and our dear babes, surrounded as you are by people who are too timorous and too susceptible of alarms. Many fears and jealousies and imaginary dangers will be suggested to you, but I hope you will not be impressed by them. In case of real danger, of which you cannot fail to have previous intimations, fly to the woods with our children. Give my tenderest love to them and to all." And so I think this is one of those letters we don't always imagine coming out of the mouths of a founding father, right? Fly to the woods with our children. But for John Adams, the political and historical significance of continuing the Patriot cause was compounded by some really familiar and personal concerns of what it costs to be a revolutionary. And John Adams, he realized that he moved, I think, at the center of history, but even he wasn't entirely sure of how it would all end. He invested everything. He banked everything in the idea of creating a new nation. So his overall experience of the revolution is it's a day-to-day saga that's unfolding, and often it's on his doorstep when he can't be there to kind of oversee the home.
Wow. It's really surprising to hear these ideas from Adams. The idea is that the revolution is an unfolding event, that it was a day-to-day occurrence with a very uncertain outcome, and that it placed his family in danger. I mean, Adams' description makes the revolution sound, well, sort of frightening.
It's somewhat terrifying to him how all of this is unfolding, and yet he is one of the primary movers of it at the Continental Congress. And I think it's important for us to remember that those delegates who are meeting, they have families, they have business deals, they have a lot of different possible futures riding on the outcome of it. But at the same time, men and women like John Adams understood, I think, the global and historical significance of what they were doing. Now, John Adams is a gifted lawyer. He's easily one of the best legal minds in the American colonies. And what he was able to understand, something that allows him to go into the Continental Congress every day and argue for independence, no matter the cost, to his family, to his farm, to his friends at home, is this one big idea. This is this major precedent in global history that American colonists are setting. The utter rejection of monarchical authority in favor of popular sovereignty. And this is a huge idea that is transformative in the 18th century world. He knows that, he appreciates it. What he doesn't totally grasp yet is how that popular sovereignty is going to work in terms of a functioning government. And that is the work that lies ahead of him. So when you have a big story like this unfolding, John Adams and others know you need a good historian or two to cover it. And he agonizes over how the doings of the American Revolution, in terms of the people who move it along and the ideas that power it, are reported in the local and foreign press. And even when he's abroad in London in 1785 to 1788, he's really concerned about how foreign historians may capture this world. He's on the brink of signing the definitive Anglo-American peace treaty in the autumn of 1783, and he takes the time to sit down and write to his daughter, Nabby. And he tells her, study the roots of the American Revolution because, and these are John Adams' words, it is the most interesting chapter in the history of the world.
So it's really clear from your descriptions that Adams clearly knows he's part of a very historic event and that he's commenting on the importance of the event he's participating in part to preserve his recollections and in part to shape the history of the revolution. Now, given that Adams was so reflective and chatty about the revolution, did he write anything about those who disagreed with him and chose to remain loyal to Great Britain?
Well, the wonderful thing about reading John Adams' letters is that he comments on virtually everything. And I think it's particularly interesting to look at John Adams' relationship with and his understanding of the loyalist point of view. So let's track through this for a minute. In the early days of the 1770s, he's quite hard on the loyalists and on the Whiggish philosophy in general. He attacks them in print, and he thinks of them as sort of a poor mirror image of corrupt British policies. His wife, Abigail, equally tough on them. In March 1776, she writes, I heartily wish every Tory was extirpated from America. They are continually, by secret means, undermining and injuring our cause. So in letters to colleagues like James Warren, John Adams portrays them as living in a state of humiliation. Those are his words. As the war begins to take a toll, he seeks loyalists, I think, as citizens who place their trust in the wrong people. He sees them as ensnared by a system they once supported. And a great deal of this plays out in the Evangelist Letters of 1775. And it's a famous exchange of pseudonymous newspaper letters between John Adams as an Evangelist and an old friend of his, a Taunton, Massachusetts lawyer named Daniel Leonard, who's writing as Massachusettensis. And this is a critical moment in the Revolution's print culture, this exchange. because their debate touches on the wisdom of extremist leadership, the powers of the Continental Congress, and the longstanding question of what constituted a proper relationship between the colonies and Britain. So really this exchange is a very snappy summary of what's going on in the American newspapers. And yet, with all things Adams, the politics is also very personal. And as an elderly man, John Adams bitterly recalled that Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson had, and again in Adams's words, seduced from my bosom three of the most intimate friends I ever had in my life, Jonathan Sewell, Samuel Quincy, and Daniel Leonard. So again, we see that this is a question of how John Adams approaches politics through the personal networks that he has. And I want to just tell a quick story about Jonathan Sewell, because he was a close friend of John Adams, and he graduated a few years ahead of him at Harvard. And in 1774, just as things are heating up in the Revolution, they're both serving at Falmouth Superior Court. And they have this incredible moment where they both realize Adams is leaning toward the Patriot cause, Sewell is leaning toward the Loyalist cause. And as their political differences become apparent, the two men opt to say farewell to their friendship. They have this amazing walk out to a mountain overlooking Casco Bay near Portland, Maine, which was then part of Massachusetts. And they have this long conversation. They decide to go their separate ways. But that's not quite the end of the story, because sometime in 1787 or 1788, when Adams is living in London, serving as the first American minister to Britain, he learns that Jonathan Sewell is nearby. He hears that Sewell is about to embark for a new life in Halifax, as many other Loyalists have done. And John Adams hastens to reunite with his old friends. And we have these two wonderful accounts that both Adams and Sewell, who are not given to big personal stories of romance, their diaries, still bother to put down there. And as they tell it in their own words, the American minister enters the room, he squeezes Jonathan Sewell's hand tightly, they sit down and they talk for 2 hours, Adams glowingly records. And again, in Adams's words, both of us forgetting that we had ever been enemies. And so to John and Abigail, the Loyalist threat to independence, nearly obliterated by the Revolution's gains, still kind of hangs like a cloud over the new republic and their relations in it. And in Boston, and again in London, Adams and his family socialized easily with Loyalists. But Adams also refutes a lot of bad press about his work there, and he thinks that the Loyalists are planning stories about him abroad. He and Abigail often think about the Loyalists in London and the intrigues they may have planned, but it's a mixed bag because he also has a lot of neighbors who are Loyalists. Where he lives in London in Grosvenor Square, he's right across the way from Frederick Lord North and his circle. So he listens to a lot of Loyalist tales of exile at dinner parties. And Loyalists like John Jeffreys, who's replanted in London, serves as the family doctor. He delivers John Adams' first grandson. So what he was able to do in the 1770s, kind of dissociate and abstract the political philosophy of the Loyalists on the page, becomes something different in the 1780s, where things are a little messier. Lines are blurred, Patriot and Loyalist. And Adams really does make an effort to reconnect with some of the other political opponents he may have had in previous arenas.
It's striking from the stories you just told how personal the revolution and the politics of it all seemed. I mean, ideology of the revolution clearly ruined friendships and sowed lots of distrust. Just how widespread was the divide between Patriots and Loyalists? Is it true that John Adams once said that we can best understand the revolution by dividing Americans into thirds, with 1/3 choosing to stand against Great Britain, a second third choosing to remain loyal to Great Britain, and a final third just trying not to choose a side?
I think this idea of thirds comes back to a misreading of a John Adams letter to James Lloyd that's dated the 20th of January, 1850. James Lloyd is not wholly a foreign figure in the Adams family circle. James Lloyd is an American politician, but he first would have been in the mix and on the radar of John Adams as a colleague of his son at Harvard in the 1780s. And John Quincy Adams, who meets him, is less than impressed. He finds him to be kind of a son of fortune, an entitled Bostonian. And as Lloyd's political career progresses, he and John Adams, an elderly John Adams, have a series of letters back and forth discussing the history of revolutions in general. This particular letter, the 28th January 1815 letter from John Adams to James Lloyd is actually about the French Revolution. Short and simple, it's a misreading. And if we know much about John Adams' career trajectory, we know that one of his great goals is to keep peace with France. However, he has some very particular views of the French Revolution that result from it. Now, here's the passage often misread as the American Revolution when, in fact, it's about the French Revolution. Here's John Adams. If I were called to estimate the divisions among the people of America, as Mr. Burke did those of the people of England, I should say that 1/3 were averse to the Revolution. Those retaining that overweening fondness in which they had been educated to be English could not cordially like the French. Indeed, they most heartily detested them. An opposite third conceived an hatred of the English and gave themselves up to an enthusiastic gratitude to France. The middle third, composed principally of the yeomanry, the soundest part of the nation and always averse to war, were rather lukewarm both to England and France, and sometimes stragglers from them, and sometimes the whole body, united with the first or the last third according to circumstances. Now, when you look at this seems like a very neat and tidy explanation, right? Dividing the country's political loyalties and patriotism into thirds. It's a very neat way of imposing order on something that John Adams knew was an incredibly messy and dynamic historical event. Now, it's interesting to think about where this mistake might stem from. And when we retrace the historiography, it looks like it begins around 1908 with historian Sidney George Fisher, who misinterprets the meaning in his book, The Struggle for American Independence, Volume 1. And this is not to say that the idea of imposing order on the revolution started with Sidney George Fisher. Clearly, it begins in kind of that founding era as men and women like John Adams, Abigail Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and others try to write their own histories of the American Revolution in a very explainable way that will set up the new republic for success. They want to provide a usable path for people moving forward through the 19th century and into today. But it's important, I think, to look at this letter and understand the moment at which the document was misread and continued to propagate the idea that John Adams endorsed this idea of thirds.
Okay, so John Adams' letter to James Lloyd was clearly misinterpreted, but it wasn't the only letter he ever wrote expressing the idea that we can understand the loyalties of the American Revolution by dividing Americans into thirds. Would you tell us about Adams's correspondence with Thomas Mckean?
That's a wonderful question because the relationship between John Adams and Thomas Mckean, of course, goes back to the Continental Congress. Here are two men, John Adams from Massachusetts, Thomas Mckean from Pennsylvania and Delaware, who are heartily invested in writing state constitutions that are formative to the federal constitution, who are interested in a functioning lowercase r Republican government more than political parties, who stay in contact throughout their entire political careers. And so there's a series of letters between 1813 and 1814 in particular I want to highlight, where Adams and Mckean are talking back and forth about the history of the American Revolution. And Adams, he thinks no historian can possibly get the story right. And to a degree, Mckean, who has zero interest in writing a history per se, he's interested in how their actions will be reflected. The really key letter to look at is John Adams' 31 August 1813 letter to Thomas Mckean. And they've been going back and forth and in true 18th century style, in fact, in true lawyer style, they keep quoting each other back and forth. You can swing into these letters at any point to get a feel for them. So by 1813, John Adams is ready to kind of formulate his comprehensive reply to Mckean. And he says, you say that at the time of the Congress in 1765, the great mass of the people were zealous in the cause of America. And John Adams is not wholly pleased with this because even in the new nation, he wants to point out sort of the regional landscape of Patriots and Loyalists. He wants Americans to remember that there are competing political views at the time of the American Revolution, and it still succeeded into creating a functional government. And this is really important to think about in the context of the summer of 1813, right, and what's going on in the world. And so he writes to Mckean and he says, it wasn't quite as easy as all that. There wasn't this incredible surge that naturally overpowered everyone. It's important that there were different political views in play. And he points out that New York and Pennsylvania were incredibly divided. And he thinks that it was really the action of patriots in New England and Virginia who keep them in line, who prevent them from joining the British. And this is something he really wants to pull out and highlight to Mckean's attention. And so he has a little follow-up at the end that I think is worth thinking about in the context of, did John Adams believe that you could neatly subdivide revolutionary political activity into thirds? And here's the line. Upon the whole, if we allow 2/3 of the people to have been with us in the revolution, is not the allowance ample? Are not 2/3 of the nation, now with the administration, divided we ever have been and ever must be? 2/3 always had and will have more difficulty to struggle with the 1/3 than with all our foreign enemies. And so I think this is a really important political philosophy that John Adams is espousing here. Regardless of what he thinks of his own legacy within the American Revolution, what he's saying here is political differences matter because they create dialogue. And this is something that's very important, especially moving through the antebellum era, that he sees as vital to American growth. And it's interesting that he's having this exchange with Mckean, right? These are kind of two old veterans from the revolutionary days, and they're still trading thoughts on, if not how to complete the revolution, what's needed to continue the impetus behind it.
So, Sarah, knowing what you know about John Adams, and given that you've read and annotated a lot of Adams's papers, do you think Adams really saw the revolution as dividing the people of the 13 colonies neatly into thirds, or did Adams just simply use the idea of thirds as a rhetorical device?
I think it's absolutely a rhetorical device that he uses to talk about political dialogue. I think that this is something that John Adams does to spotlight a cultural habit that's developed during the Revolution that he'd like to see continue. Because in 1813, John Adams, as a family man who's just lost his daughter, who's looking at worsening relations with Britain, who's examining the rise of Napoleon, who's just back in touch with his good old frenemy, Thomas Jefferson. I think this is the moment where he's thinking about, what did we do during the Revolution that we could do again? And for that, the idea of thirds helps him to think about, is there a balance within the revolution? Is there a way to balance political dialogue so that you have as many people as possible participating? Because remember, the great concern that John Adams and that his son John Quincy Adams will have is how to keep the American Union afloat. Union is all, party spirit is not. And so I think this allows him to kind of open up that conversation. And it matters a great deal that it's with Thomas Mckean. So yes, I do think it's a rhetorical device that he uses to great effect here.
John Adams lived through the Revolution. He took a leading role in it, and yet he seems to have spent an awful lot of time grappling with its meaning and trying to figure out just what happened during the event. And from what Sarah shared with us, this makes sense, right? I mean, the letters Adams wrote during the Revolution clearly reflect how dangerous, uncertain, and messy the period was, as do his personal relationships with men like Jonathan Sewell, for that matter. The Revolution clearly divided Americans, but how divided were they? It's clear John Adams didn't mean for us to take literally his rhetorical device of dividing Americans into thirds. He meant it only to express that the Revolution deeply divided Americans. So this information leaves us with our original question: how many people supported the Revolution? And adds another: why is the Loyalist past of the American Revolution so difficult for us to think about and understand? These seem like perfect questions for Maya Jasanoff, the Coolidge Professor of History at Harvard University and author of the book Liberty's Exiles: American Loyalists in the Revolutionary World. Maya, in 2011, your book Liberty's Exiles received a lot of attention because it really offered us the first global history of the Loyalist migration out of the United States. So, would you tell us a bit about Loyalists? I mean, who were they and why did they choose to remain loyal to the crown rather than support the American Revolution?
I think that the main thing we need to remember about loyalists is that the question to ask isn't so much why did they remain loyal? The question to ask is why did everyone else decide to rebel? Because loyalty is kind of the default position. I mean, even in America today, when we don't like the result of an election, people don't usually try to upend the entire system. They might go out and look for change within it, but that's quite different. So I think that if we turn the question around, it becomes a little bit less confusing. These were people who had grown up their entire lives under British rule, who had been raised to think of the king as the source of authority and government, and in certain cases, protection against foreign enemies. In the case of the French and Indian War, for example, which many Americans alive at the time of the Revolution would have also been alive for. So I think when you factor in ties of culture, ties of religion, ties of economy, ties of a sense of just what the right order of a state was, then we can really see why it was the default position for so many Americans at the beginning of the war to stay loyal. And the weird thing is, why did the others rebel?
That's a really interesting point. And I wonder if we look at this weird thing, right? The Americans who rebelled, we see that they rebelled in different degrees. I mean, some joined a local committee of safety, others joined a local militia unit, and some just joined a mob. Were there different degrees of loyalism as well?
Yes, there definitely were, and it was a kind of similar situation where you had some people, for example, very prominent government officials in the run-up to the Revolution. I'm thinking of somebody like the governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, who actually left the colonies well before any of the first military action took place. So you have people right up at the top of the government pyramid who leave the future United States or step down from their positions very, very early. You then have, once the fighting begins, you have loyalists who are joining loyalist militias in the same way you have patriots joining up their militias and eventually the Continental Army. And then you have a whole bunch of people who are what you might call sort of ordinary loyalists or quiet loyalists. These would be people who were basically just trying to kind of lie low, who maybe had no particular sympathy for the revolutionary movement, but who weren't upping sticks and joining militias or even really trying to do much of anything except go on with their lives, hoping that the war wouldn't interfere with them too much. And I think that was a pretty widespread phenomenon, particularly, of course, in the parts of the country where the fighting did not, at least at the outset, extend.
I wonder if we could talk numbers for a moment, because John Adams and earlier historians of the Revolution have claimed that the Revolution divided the population of the 13 colonies into these tidy proportions of thirds. Did your research into loyalists reveal that this was the case?
You know, it's a funny thing about numbers because the truth is we don't really have any. The best that we can do is actually based on making kind of demographic estimates on the back of militia registration, because that is something that we really do have numbers for. And that reckoning tends to support the idea that I think is fairly widely held that certainly by the end of the war, we're talking maybe 1 in 5 people being loyal. As to the beginning of the war, it's a fact that the Adams estimate is one of the only references that we really have. Ironically enough, though, it turns out that there seems to be some confusion about what exactly Adams was talking about. There's one interpretation which says that actually he was talking about the French Revolution in exactly the same way that he is believed to have said the one-third for early America. I would say, again, we don't have census data. We don't have formal ways of reckoning. What does seem to be borne out, based on my research, would certainly be the sense that if we look at Adams's estimates, we find that only 1 in 3, according to him, were outspoken patriots, which is to say that the majority of the colonial population was actually not particularly committed to the revolutionary and eventually secessionist cause. I think that that strikes me as a fair statement that in 1775, certainly, you wouldn't be looking at a colonial population in which the majority of whites were thinking already that they wanted to secede. I just don't think that's where anybody really stood. Even some of the future patriots who themselves in 1775 were not necessarily advocating independence outright from Britain at that juncture either.
You noted that by the end of the war, we think that the estimate is somewhere around 1 in 5 Americans was a loyalist. That seems like a lot of people. What was the Revolution and War for Independence like for all these loyal men and women?
One of the things that I think we tend to lose sight of a little bit when we talk about the American Revolution in terms of the Declaration of Independence, of course, ultimately at the other end of it, the Constitution some years afterwards, is that we tend to see this as a war of ideals, that it's about liberty and equality and freedom from tyranny and so forth. And yet, when you look at what actually unfolded on the ground here in the future United States, it was a war. We drop the war when we talk about revolution. It was a war of ordeals as much as it was a war of ideals. And for the people who were caught in the front lines, it was a very difficult experience. I think that probably went for Patriots as well as Loyalists, but I can certainly say that in the case of Loyalists, as the Continental Army advanced through different parts of the 13 colonies / United States, Loyalists who were caught on the wrong side of enemy lines or who feared that they might be tended to run to British-held locations for safety. The British held the city of New York for the vast majority of the war. They also held the cities of Charleston and Savannah, and these places became real kind of strongholds for Loyalists. The story of New York City, I think, is particularly interesting because New York City at the beginning of the war was a fairly mixed place. There were plenty of people who became patriots, but when the British took the city, the patriot residents of New York City left. And then at the very end of the war, in the evacuation of the British Army in 1783, the Loyalists basically all left and the Patriots came back in. And so you end up having one of the biggest cities in the United States actually having its entire population turned over twice over the course of this war. And if you think about the numbers, we're, 30,000, something like that, people coming in and out. This is a society very much on the move, a society in flux, a society in which anyone caught in the way of an advancing army is going to do their best to try to stay safe. And sometimes that means leaving their homes altogether. Sometimes it means hiding out in the barn and hoping people don't come and get you. And it meant for Loyalists in particular that there was a vast kind of migration within the country to these cities held by the British.
The way you talk about the war and its effects on people's lives makes me wonder, do you think we should look upon the Revolution as a civil war?
I certainly do. I think it's interesting always to think about terminology. In Britain, if you talk about the American Revolution, they will say the War of American Independence. They won't call it the Revolution, the American Revolution. It's the War of Independence. And I actually think the War of Independence is simply, in terms of accuracy, a pretty good name for what happened. It was a war, and it was fought in order to get independence for the 13 colonies. But it was very much a civil war. And, of course, we don't call it that now because there was the far more famous and devastating Civil War of the 1860s between the 18th century and now. Yet, in the time, in the 18th century and in the decades afterward, people very much called it a civil war. They thought of it in those terms. They experienced it in those terms because they saw families divided. They saw communities turned in on themselves, and they saw different factions of society fighting one another. It was very much a civil war, and it caught up in it almost every sector of American colonial society.
Earlier, you mentioned that your research is really focused on the Loyalists who left the United States. Did Loyalists have a choice about whether to remain in the United States, or did the Patriots force them to leave?
Loyalists definitely had a choice, but I think that we need to remember that every choice is made under the circumstances that a person is presented with. And I think that the experience of the war left many people right at the end of it extremely uncertain about what was going to happen next. So if you were living in New York City, for example, which was the last city to be evacuated by the British, you would have seen in the press lots of reports from different parts of the country of Patriot militias and so forth going out into the countryside and harassing Loyalists. You would have read accounts perhaps of your property in different places that had been abandoned by Loyalists to find security in the British-held cities. You might have read that that property had been attacked or looted in one way or another. And you might also have read threatening circulars and broadsides that were put out by Patriots claiming that they would exert kind of rough justice on Loyalists who stayed. And so under those circumstances, I think we have to remember that Loyalists, who were, of course, the losers of the war, found themselves facing a future that they couldn't predict and found themselves confronted by real push factors out of the future United States. Offsetting that, there were also pull factors, and the Loyalists who were in the cities of Savannah, Charleston, New York, as the British left, were offered by the British various incentives to leave in the form of free passage on British ships, in the form of possible land grants to be given to them in other British colonies, most particularly in Canada and Nova Scotia, and also certain kinds of supplies just to tide them over, like farm implements and food rations and so on and so forth. So I think when we put these things together, of course, we can say Loyalists had a choice, and indeed the vast majority of Loyalists didn't leave the United States. But for those who did, the choice was structured, I think, very, very heavily by these competing incentives, some of which definitely were fears of what would happen to them if they stayed behind.
We've talked about the fact that we'll just never know how many Americans chose to be patriots or remain loyal or adopt a neutral stance. But do we know how many Loyalists chose to leave the United States after the war?
That we do, and there are some ledgers kept by the British, for example, of people who did evacuate the cities, and we also have records that indicate numbers of people who settled in other British colonies. And the estimate that I could come up with on the basis of those records was approximately 60,000, and those 60,000 Loyalists who left also took with them approximately 15,000 slaves, so that would bring the total number of individuals leaving to about 75,000.
What was it like for the Loyalists to leave the United States, and where did they all go?
They went basically wherever the British could take them or wherever they could get on their own. And that mostly meant the other British colonies in North America. So at the time of the Revolution, there were actually 26 British colonies in North America, 13 of which rebelled and 13 of which didn't. And those that didn't included Nova Scotia in the north and the other provinces of today's Canada, and also included a bunch of the colonies in the Caribbean. So not surprisingly, I think, we see a lot of flows of Loyalists from particularly the southern colonies of the future United States heading down to the Caribbean. So we see a number going to Jamaica, which was at the time the wealthiest colony in the British Empire. We also see quite a lot going to the Bahamas, and they went to the Bahamas because this was an area very much under British rule, but that actually hadn't been particularly densely settled at that time, and so there was land available, and it was held out to the Loyalists as a kind of incentive to go. The vast majority of Loyalists who left the United States did end up going to the north to Canada. So many, in fact, that they really changed the complexion of the population in the provinces today of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Ontario. And in fact, prior to the Revolution, Nova Scotia included what is today New Brunswick, and it was with the arrival of the Loyalists that there were so many people founding genuinely new cities like St. John, New Brunswick, that the British actually decided to separate the provinces to make the administration easier. Some also went to the province of Quebec. And in addition to the fairly large diaspora around the British Atlantic colonies, there was also, of course, a number who went to Britain itself. And a lot of the time people say to me, well, where did they go? Did they go back to Britain? And I often point out that for most Loyalists, Britain was a foreign country. Most of them had been born and raised in what was now the United States and didn't have any connection to Britain beyond language and so forth. So a certain number of Loyalists did go to Britain. Typically, these were better placed Loyalists, that is to say, people with a little more money, a little more social connections, and they would try to make a go of it there, often to find it kind of cold and unfriendly and a little difficult to make their way in, but some flourished there. And then finally, we actually end up seeing Loyalists going to pretty much everywhere the British were in the world at that time. You know, for all that Britain lost the United States, and this was the biggest loss of territory for the British Empire until the 20th century, Britain nonetheless comes out of the American Revolution and goes into the 19th century as the leading imperial power in the world. This is a growing concern, the British Empire, and it's expanding quite conspicuously in India. It will go on in the 1780s to settle Australia, and they also stake out new territories in, among other places, West Africa. And Loyalists are part of all of these projects. You find Loyalists involved in settling Australia as convicts. You find Loyalists popping up in the military of the East India Company in India. And in particular, you find Black Loyalists, former slaves, who become the pioneering settlers of one of Britain's new colonial endeavors, that is the city of Freetown in Sierra Leone in West Africa.
I was just going to ask, out of the 60,000 Americans who left the United States, how many were free Africans and African Americans? And did they experience the Revolution and their departure from the United States in the same ways that white Loyalists did?
African Americans absolutely have different experiences from white loyalists in the central respect that they were slaves, and for them, the promises held out by Britain right from the beginning of the war, 1775, by the governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore in the first instance, and then various other British commanders after. The promise that was held out to them was, hey, run away from your masters, come to us, join our army, and we will make you free. And if you hear that promise from the British and you run to them and they do give you your freedom, it's a type of freedom that sounds kind of better and looks better than the freedom that is being advertised by your owners in the form of Patrick Henry, for example, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, etc., every one of whom owned slaves who ended up running away to the British. So for the Black Loyalists, as they're called, the war was actually an occasion for a certain kind of liberation in the sense that they left their masters, they left a condition of slavery. And in fact, at the end of the war, they actually were evacuated from the United States with the British in freedom. And there's in fact a kind of famous incident toward the end of the war when the British Commander-in-Chief, Sir Guy Carleton, meets with George Washington, and they're working out various things to do with how the city of New York will be handed over between Britain and the United States and so on. And one of the things that Washington is very concerned about is that he's heard that the British are taking slaves away. And slaves, according to Washington, are of course a major form of property, and the British have no right, according to the peace treaty, to take property out of the United States. But Carleton says back to him, this isn't property, these are people who are freed, and they fought for us, and we promised to take them away, and we will. And so out of New York City alone, about 3,000 former slaves were evacuated on British ships, taken to Nova Scotia. And so I think this promise of freedom is very important. I think we need to take it seriously. They took it seriously. They were evacuated in freedom. That said, another way in which the experience of the Black Loyalists differed from that of the whites was that they were often subject to kind of worse conditions than their white peers. So even though they were given land and they were given food and so forth, at least in theory and practice, often their allocations fell short. Many of them were, one way or another, kind of roped into conditions of sort of indentured servitude to white loyalists. And so they did not have, one could say, as flourishing an experience of it in exile. But I do think that their experience is very significant in thinking about what freedom could mean in this era, and that for these enslaved African Americans, the type of freedom offered by Britain was actually far more compelling than the one on offer in the slaveholding United States.
I know we'll never have exact numbers, but was your research able to provide you with a glimpse of whether the British promise of freedom caused more Africans and African Americans to side with the British rather than with the Patriots during the war?
That's a great question. We actually do have pretty good numbers on the number of Black Loyalists. I think some scholars have estimated around 20,000 slaves ran to the British during the course of the war, about 8,000 to 10,000 of whom survived the war. As a percentage of the slave population, however, I think it's hard for us to hold that up against those who, quote-unquote, became Patriot, because these are people who don't really have the freedom to make certain kinds of political choices independent of what their potentially Patriot masters tell them to do. Vice versa, of course, if they have Loyalist masters, and there are cases of Loyalist masters letting their slaves join the British, just as there are cases of Loyalist masters making a point of trying to take away as many slaves as they possibly can with them into exile in Jamaica and the Bahamas. I think it's a little difficult to put our finger on that number, but I think that it's fair to say that there's well-attested evidence to suggest that many of the slaves who ran to join the British did so with a clear knowledge of the proclamations that had been made by the British commanders. These were kind of conscious and reasoned and informed political choices.
And what about the choices free African Americans made with regards to loyalty during the war? I know we're talking about a really small population here, but George Washington did allow some northern free African Americans to serve in the Continental Army.
The numbers, as you say, are quite small. And of course, we do know that there are African Americans who join the Revolutionary Forces, just as there are enslaved African and African Americans who join the Revolutionary Forces. I mean, I think perhaps the salient point here to draw out is perhaps there are two. I think one is that decisions that people make in times of crisis are decisions that are made, at least in part, I believe, on the basis of contingent circumstances. What do you have to gain? What do you have to lose by making a certain choice? And then the other point to make is the more ideological point, which is to say that freedom meant different things. I mean, part of what makes the American Revolution so fascinating and makes it part of what historians call the Age of Revolutions, accompanied, of course, by the Haitian Revolution and the French Revolution, is that this is a time when the notion of freedom and the notion of what it is to be an individual in relation to the state is getting fundamentally rethought and worked out in very, very different ways. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that we see people who occupy very different subject positions adopting a pretty wide range of views on this, because this is a time when those ideas are being hashed out. I think that the key point, perhaps, for Americanists to remember, and I think most scholars would certainly accept this now, is that the American Patriot version of freedom was only one of various versions of freedom, and it spoke strongly to some people just as it manifestly excluded other people. And the British had their own versions of that with similar forms of inclusion and exclusion. And to an extent, the Anglo-American world is still dealing with a kind of construction of liberty that we know to this day is emancipatory in many, many instances, but also can have people left out or certain kinds of costs.
Now, prior to the publication of Liberty's Exiles, it really seemed like most historians, from John Adams's time to 2011, were really reluctant to talk about Loyalists. And I wonder if you could tell us why you think Americans have had such a hard time reckoning with the Revolution's Loyalist past.
One of the things I got interested in was exactly this, wondering why people hadn't really looked at this. And I found myself going back to the work of the first person who very seriously tried to study the Loyalists, and that was Lorenzo Sabine, who was working in the mid-19th century. And he compiled a biographical dictionary. And he wrote in his preface that it was just very difficult to follow men who left their homes, as he put it, that people who leave don't leave that many traces behind. And in fact, he had stumbled across the topic of loyalism as a very young man in down East Maine because he had been in an area where, in fact, there were a fair number of loyalists who left and went up to Nova Scotia. And he saw the gravestones and he thought, this is kind of interesting. Who are these people and what's going on here? He was right on the border with Canada and saw evidence of this migration. So there's a partly practical question, I think, which is that the archives are quite simply dispersed. There's another issue, though, which I think is a more perhaps ideological one, and that is that, of course, the nationalist story of our country is a story of unity, and that was a message that, of course, was challenged but ultimately reinforced, I think, in the era of the Civil War, which was indeed when Sabine was writing. And I think that there was at the time also a tendency to think of loyalism as being a rather fringe phenomenon associated with a particular kind of elite character, very Anglican, very wealthy, very attached to the British government. And that also, I think, helped to serve certain kinds of American nationalist ideas of what this republic was about, and that it was a non-aristocratic society, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot of reasons bound up with the history of American national identity that come into play here. That said, I do think that there was a very important moment around the time of the bicentennial when loyalism was taken seriously by historians. And I think that that's partly because that was a time when, of course, people were looking with fresh eyes at the American Revolution, but I think they were also looking at the American Revolution with a sense to create a kind of more inclusive picture of what was going on in the Revolutionary era, looking at the experiences of women and slaves and Indians and so on. And I think that the same inclination to look at the diversity of experiences in the revolution demographically also yielded a sense of the ideological diversity at that time. And one of the early and very important books in this scholarship would be Bernard Bailyn's book, The Ordeal of Thomas Hutchinson, which took very seriously the possibility that loyalism was a valid ideological position. And I think Bailyn and his peers were kind of the pioneers in a type of loyalist studies that generation of scholars now, myself included, is building on.
And do you think it's still the case today that historians have this sense of inclusion when it comes to history, which is ultimately enabling us to finally grapple with the revolution's loyalist past?
I do think that we've gone, obviously, into some kind of different moment of reckoning with what the revolution means to us. I mean, I think that that's ultimately why so many historians are drawn to this historical period. And I can certainly say from my own experience that living in the United States the last 20 years or so, it seems to me very interesting to think about where ideological difference comes from in our society. I think it's important to add that I came to this topic not as a trained historian of early America or the United States, but actually as a historian of Britain and the British Empire. And I think that it's partly because I came from that vantage point that I was able to see the question in slightly different terms. I think for what it's worth, it's also important to note that the British have their own reasons not to want to look at the American Revolution too closely because it was a war they lost. And part of the lacuna historiographically has been a British reluctance to engage with this history. But yeah, I think that today there is an interest in recovering the plural and diverse experiences of the American past. And I personally believe that recovering the ideological diversity of the American past is a very important part of that project. And if I may add, I think it's a particularly important part for us to reckon with in a period when so many people are observing such partisanship in political life today.
Looking at the revolution today through all of the historical sources we have available to us, historians estimate that 1 in 3 Americans supported the revolution and 1 in 5 Americans remain loyal to Great Britain. And of those loyalists, approximately 60,000 of them left the United States after the war, taking with them approximately 15,000 slaves. Our conversation with Maya is a good reminder that we tend to view the American Revolution as a war of ideals, but in reality, it was a violent civil war. It was an armed conflict that pit American against American, Britain against Britain. It was also a war that held different experiences for different people. Africans and African Americans did not experience the revolution the same way that white people experienced the revolution. Which leads us to a couple of new questions. How did Africans and African Americans experience the revolution, and what opportunities did they have to support the Patriot and Loyalist cause? I wonder if these are good questions for Vincent Corretta. Vin is a professor emeritus of English at the University of Maryland and the author of Phyllis Wheatley, Biography of a Genius in Bondage. He's also an expert in 18th century transatlantic authors of African descent. Slavery played a large role in almost every facet of early American history. Vin, did slavery play a role in the American Revolution?
It sure did. In fact, in some ways, the way historians have dealt with slavery in the American Revolution up until the very recent past is kind of reminiscent of the way historians dealt with the issue of slavery and its relationship to the Civil War up until pretty much the middle of the 20th century, in which it was very downplayed. It was not seen as a major cause of the Civil War. Now, it didn't play as large a role in the American Revolution as it did in the Civil War, but the fact that the Declaration of Independence doesn't address the issue, but Jefferson's draft of the Declaration of Independence certainly does, because in the draft, he accuses King George III of forcing slavery on the colonists and forcing the colonists to import slaves from Africa. The reason that it was not included in the final declaration, according to Jefferson himself, was that there were objections from Georgia and South Carolina who wanted to continue the transatlantic slave trade. And so they pressured the Continental Congress to drop the whole conversation about slavery in the Declaration.
I wonder if we could talk about Phyllis Wheatley and use her as a window onto how African Americans experienced and participated in the American Revolution. Would you tell us about Wheatley and why some scholars consider her first among a generation of revolutionary African Americans?
Well, Phyllis Wheatley was the first person of African descent to publish a book. And she was enslaved somewhere in Western Africa, we're not quite sure where, in 1761 when she was brought to Boston. She was around the age of 7 or 8 years old. And she was sold there to John and Susanna Wheatley. John Wheatley was a merchant. He had a transatlantic business. And they experimented with her. They quickly discovered or recognized that she was highly intelligent, a child prodigy. And they gave her an extraordinary education, not only extraordinary for someone of African descent, or not only extraordinary for a woman, but extraordinary for anyone. They even exposed her to at least some degree of Latin. And she was able to compose verse in English within 4 years of having reached the colonies. And by 1770, remember, she's still just a teenager, she sent apparently unsolicited elegy on the death of George Whitefield to Whitefield's English patron, the Countess of Huntingdon. And in this poem, she creates a persona that speaks for we Americans. So in effect, she's creating a notion of an American identity that includes people of African descent. And that poem was published in Boston and London, and it brought the first American poet, whether white or black, free or enslaved, transatlantic fame. And eventually it led to the publication of her poems in 1773, which was the first book of any kind published by an African American, and only the second book published by a woman in America. And prior to her manumission in the summer of 1773, her criticism of slavery was very subtle in her poetry. But once she was free, she became much more overt in her comments on slavery.
You mentioned that Wheatley received her freedom in 1773. In addition to becoming more outspoken against slavery with her freedom, did she speak out for or against the imperial crisis or participate in the revolution in some other way?
Well, as a woman, she wouldn't be able to participate in the way a man could participate. She participated through her words. She addressed, for example, in 1772, when the Earl of Dartmouth was made the Secretary of State for the Northern Colonies and the President of the Board of Trade, she sent him a poem celebrating his appointment. And in that poem, she talks about her authority for talking about freedom. And she says that her authority is based on her own experience of having been enslaved, so she can appreciate what freedom would be, even though, again, she was a slave at the time she sent it to him. So that's one way she participated. Then after she was free, in December of 1775, she sent a poem to George Washington celebrating his appointment as, she called it, Generalissimo of the Continental Army.
The Earl of Dartmouth and George Washington were men of consequence. How was Wheatley able to get these men her poems? And how did she get them to read and consider her views?
Well, to do it, she was pretty cheeky. To write to anyone of that stature, just as in her poem that she addressed to the Countess of Huntingdon, which she sent to her accompanied by a letter. This was quite extraordinary for someone of not just her status, but for anyone to just write to people of that level without being invited to do so. And in her letters to each of them, she does say, I realize that I'm, you might say, being pushy to address you, but here's a poem. And with the Countess of Huntingdon, she had a connection through her owner, Susanna Wheatley. With Dartmouth, the connection was, again, through the Countess of Huntingdon, because the Countess of Huntingdon had sent someone to check out whether Phyllis Wheatley was the real deal, whether this was actually a young woman, a teenager of African descent, a slave who was capable of writing such a poem. And she wrote the poem to Dartmouth on the command of Dartmouth's representative, who had come to Boston to see if she could indeed write such a poem. And the George Washington poem, now at that point she's free, and so she does that on her own volition. And he wrote back to her, and he made sure that her poem was published by Thomas Paine, in fact.
So Phyllis Wheatley wrote to both Dartmouth and Washington, two men on opposite sides of the imperial crisis, and her poems to both men contained her thoughts on politics. Was Wheatley hedging her bets here and testing the waters of both the Loyalist and Patriot sides?
Well, I think there are, again, like most things at this time, it gets pretty complicated. A lot depends on whether you try to interpret her actions synchronically or diachronically. In other words, whether we say, okay, was she always this synchronically? At all times, was she in the same rhetorical and political position? Or do we look at her diachronically, which, of course, I think is the way we have to deal with her? When was she saying what she was saying? What was her social, legal condition when she was saying it? How free was she to express an opinion? When she's writing to Dartmouth, this is 1772, the revolution has not begun. There was a lot of hope that the tensions between the colonies and Britain might be resolved peacefully. When she writes to Washington, of course, the war is on. as you know, the attitude in the colonies towards Britain throughout the war was not uniform. There were loyalists, there were revolutionaries or rebels, and there was, of course, the middle who was waiting to see what was going to happen. And if you were a slave, you had to try to figure out, well, who do I put my money on? Who do I bet on? And who you would bet on may depend upon how the course of the war seems to be going. Now, most of the people of African descent, according to the historical evidence we have, the ones who moved chose the British side, and they had fairly good reasons for doing so.
So, taking into account when Wheatley wrote Dartmouth and Washington, did your research reveal Wheatley's true political beliefs? I mean, do we know whether she was a patriot, loyalist, or perhaps a neutral or disaffected person?
Before the Revolution, she wrote a poem to George III, thanking him for repealing the Stamp Act. She was, in some ways, hedging her bets. No one knew how things were going to turn out. They knew that the British had offered freedom to any slaves of rebels who fled to the British side, and so they had reason to bet on the British. On the other hand, some of the colonies offered freedom to, now we're talking about black males, slaves who joined the colonial side. Some of them were promised freedom for doing so at the end of the war. So if you were an African-American slave, you really had to, even more so than a white colonist who was kind of in the middle, you had to try to guess, well, whose promises could we trust? People of African descent or African-American slaves faced the decision of, well, does the ideology that these rebels are professing about all men being created equal, etc., are they going to include us as men? And of course, if you're a woman, they're even more marginalized than African-American men. So, whose side do you bet on?
It sounds like the American Revolution made political allegiance really complicated, and probably even more so for people of African descent.
It did indeed. Even if you were a free black, it was very complicated. That's why you had in 1773 slaves petitioning for freedom in Massachusetts. You had 7 free blacks petitioning in Massachusetts in 1780 against being taxed without representation. So they were picking up on the ideology of the rebels. It didn't do them a lot of good, but they thought, well, okay, let's bet on that they're going to be consistent in their ideology, and it's going to apply to us as well.
Speaking of patriot ideology, some scholars have seen Wheatley as a victim of the American Revolution rather than a participant in it. Would you tell us why this is and what you think of Wheatley's involvement in the Revolution?
I guess I don't think of her as a victim of the American Revolution beyond the sense that she made the wrong bet. If she had chosen to stay in Britain in 1773, when she went there after the Mansfield decision, when she could have refused to go back to America as a slave, she would have probably become quite famous. She was reviewed generally very publicly in the British press. She gets mentioned by people who were very closely associated with Samuel Johnson's circle, so she probably would have gotten into his orbit if she had stayed in Britain. And she had every reason to think that she was going to succeed financially after 1773. She was freed by her owners when she went back within a month of her return, but to bet on the success of the American Revolution and that it would extend freedom and liberty and, if not citizenship, maybe citizenship to her husband, that was a bad decision ultimately in retrospect. So I suppose in that sense, one could say she was a victim of the American Revolution. She did participate in it by word, of course, with the praise of George Washington. As I say, that poem was publicized. When the war ended, she published a poem called Liberty and Peace, celebrating the victory of the American rebels and looking forward to an age of prosperity that unfortunately did not include her and her husband. So she celebrated Columbia, the concept of Columbia, which was the allegorical figure that was commonly used to refer to the new United States. So she was hopeful at the end, but she was disappointed in her personal life.
Finn, you just noted a lot of ways that Phyllis Wheatley participated in the revolution with her writing. Did her poems have any impact on the course of the revolution?
Now, if we're talking about contemporary impact during her lifetime, or even up until, say, 1800, her words tended to get reproduced in Britain as part of the anti-slavery and anti-slave trade campaign in Britain. Her words were reprinted in Britain by John Wesley, for example, and so she was often cited, especially outside of America, as an example of the literary achievements, the intellectual achievements that people of African descent were capable of having. We have to keep in mind that most people of African descent were not exposed to the opportunities that Phyllis Wheatley was, that they were not given the chance to become literate the way Phyllis Wheatley was, were not given the opportunity to publish. So she's an extraordinary figure, and she was a threat to people like Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson writes about Phyllis Wheatley very briefly. He says, "Religion made a Phyllis Wheatley, but couldn't make a poet." And he condemned her poetry as worthless. And he probably felt the need to do so because for him to recognize her literary achievements would concede that people of African descent had intellectual capacity equal to that of Europeans.
It kind of sounds like some patriots would have preferred if people of African descent had stayed out of the revolution.
Very much had an interest. It was mainly an economic interest, keeping them out of the American Revolution. One thing I didn't mention in talking about her relationship with George Washington is while George Washington was in Cambridge, a number of his slaves down in Virginia ran off and joined the British, which Phyllis Wheatley would not have known about at the time. But George Washington resisted allowing slaves and even free blacks from joining the revolutionary cause. He only did so under pressure because Lord Dunmore, the British royal governor of Virginia in 1775, offered freedom to any slaves of rebels in Virginia who fled their masters and joined the British forces. It was only after that that Washington allowed slaves to join the Continental Army.
Lord Dunmore's was an enticing offer, one that convinced many enslaved men and women to side with the British. Do we know in what numbers people of African descent sided with the British or with the Patriots?
The enslaved Africans certainly had reason to choose the British because in the political system, there was a choice between being subjects of the king, and everyone was subject of the king, including slaves, or to hope that you would be granted citizenship under the republic that the American rebels were fighting for. And many of the enslaved Africans already knew what they were getting from their American owners, and they thought that the British couldn't be worse. The Dunmore Proclamation was one of several that the British gave during the war. There are at least 3 proclamations at different times during the American Revolution in which the British offered freedom to the slaves of rebels who joined them. And the most conservative estimate of the number of slaves who joined the British is about 20,000. And the estimates go up to 100,000. Now, this is at a time when there are about 500,000 slaves in what became the United States. So it's a fairly significant percentage. And the number of people of African descent who joined the rebel side was approximately 5,000. So it's a very significant difference. Free blacks joined both sides. Part of the problem is we just don't have the kind of hard evidence we would like to have or need to have to be able to say free blacks joined the American revolutionaries and enslaved joined the British side, because there were enslaved African Americans who joined the American side as well on the promise of freedom. Some of them were sent to join the American side by their masters in lieu of the service of the masters. In other words, they took the master's place. And sometimes that was with a guarantee that they would get freedom at the end, sometimes not. It's just a very complicated situation. There's a book that came out last year called The Common Cause by Robert Parkinson. And one of his central arguments is that one of the ways that the rebels were able to get all of the colonies to agree to resist the British was to create a common cause by creating a common internal enemy that consisted primarily of the Native Americans and the slaves. And so that these fractious 13 colonies that were fighting amongst themselves before the American Revolution, they were having all sorts of conflicts amongst themselves, that this notion of this kind of a fifth column within the colonies themselves was a way to get the colonies to collaborate against the British. So there was a lot of repetition of accounts of insurrections by slaves and fears that the slaves would go over to the British, and playing up the fact that slaves were going over to the British to try to get the colonies to collaborate in resisting the British together. So that's another way in which slavery was a very important issue in the American Revolution.
Okay, we knew the Revolution was a complicated affair. I mean, John Adams' letters just showed us how he lost friends over politics and had to worry for the safety of his family. And Maya's statistics just demonstrated that only 1 in 3 Americans supported the revolution. But our conversation with Vin, that has just complicated what we know even more. First, there's the fact that there doesn't seem to have been one uniform way Americans participated in the revolution. Women couldn't and didn't participate in politics, slaves weren't even allowed to choose a side unless they ran away, and patriots generally didn't want people of African descent to participate in the revolution at all. And yet, women and African Americans like Phyllis Wheatley persisted and insisted on participating in the revolution and being heard. And you have to admit, the way Wheatley ensured her voice was heard is impressive. She not only managed to get the Earl of Dartmouth and George Washington to read her poems, she got them to engage with her political ideas. And yet, when you put Wheatley's accomplishments, as well as those of other women and people of African descent, within the context of what Vin just told us, that the Patriots attempted to organize and solidify support for their cause by portraying African Americans and Native Americans as duplicitous internal enemies? Somehow Wheatley's accomplishments and those of others seem even more powerful and striking. This new information also raises some new questions. What did Native Americans think about the revolution? And what roles did they play in the event? There are so many different Native groups that we could investigate here. But as our story has mostly focused on the Northeast, let's head south. Let's ask Kathleen Duvall, the Bowman and Gordon Gray Distinguished Term Professor of History at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and author of Independence Lost, Lives on the Edge of the American Revolution, what Native Americans living in the Gulf Coast thought about the revolution. Kathleen, your research and latest book, Independence Lost, seek to remind us that the American Revolution really wasn't just about white Americans who lived within Great Britain's 13 North American colonies, but that the revolution took place far outside of those colonies as well. So, I wonder if you would tell us how the War for American Independence came to have theaters in places like the Gulf Coast.
Well, at the end of the 7 Years' War, which France lost, Britain took over a lot more land in North America than it had before. So all of the lands between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River became part of the British Empire, at least according to the way that Europeans thought about these things. And at the same time, Spain, who had been France's ally in the 7 Years' War, got the western half of what had been the huge colony of Louisiana. So Spain took over all of the formerly French posts in Louisiana, including New Orleans, west of the Mississippi. So suddenly, at the end of the 7 Years' War, Spain and Britain had a border between their empires on the Mississippi River. When the American Revolution broke out, when it started on the East Coast, Spain was ready to take advantage of this war to try to expand its empire even further. And so in some ways, the French and Spanish thought of the American Revolution as kind of a rematch of the 7 Years' War, a chance to bring the British back into war and maybe make up for some of the losses, particularly that France had had in that war.
Now, many of the people who lived in the Gulf Coast region during the Revolution weren't European colonists, but Native Americans. Would you tell us about the region in the Revolutionary period and how Gulf Coast Native Americans fit within the British and European empires that claim their territory?
Well, if you think
about the North American continent on the eve of the American Revolution, it is a place where Europeans have settled some of the coast. So the British colonies, most of them are stretching pretty close to the Appalachian Mountains by then, but not much west of the Appalachians. And along the Gulf Coast, Texas and New Mexico and California, the Spanish and the French before them have just a few posts along the coast, occasionally up a river. But most of the interior, the vast interior of North America, was still American Indian space, controlled by separate American Indian nations. On the eve of the American Revolution, there are a vast number, hundreds of American Indian nations in the interior of the continent. And many of them, certainly those who lived near colonies, had trading relationships, diplomatic relationships with European colonies. So you have to sort of remember at this point, by the end of the 18th century, Europeans and American Indians have been in contact with each other for a couple of centuries. So they have pretty long-standing relationships of trade and alliance. But it really is just that. So when it comes to the American Revolution, Native nations will make their decisions as nations. They'll debate about them. They'll worry about what to do. They'll change their minds over time. But they don't make decisions as completely loyal to one side or the other. They'll make decisions as nations. And those decisions will rest on who they've been allied to before, but also who can provide them the most trade, who's asking reasonable things out of them versus unreasonable things. In fact, if you look at a European map of the time, you can see that Europeans claim the whole continent of North America, but even on those European maps, right underneath those big claims of, this is Virginia, this is Louisiana, are hundreds of different Native American tribal names that are also written on the map. So even Europeans recognize that Indians control most of the land in this era, and that if they're going to be involved in this war, it's going to be on their own terms. It's going to be for their own reasons.
Did colonists also recognize that Native American peoples lived in sovereign nations and made their own decisions, and that they couldn't just get their home empires to force Native Americans to do what they didn't want to do?
Colonists knew that empires didn't force nations to do things. Now, the British colonists were putting a lot of pressure on the British government to try to force Indians to give over more land. And after the American Revolution, Americans will try to do that, try to follow through on that and tell Indians that they don't live in sovereign nations, that they can't conduct diplomacy with the United States on the same level as the United States. But everybody in this era who ends up dealing with American Indians finds out that, in fact, they do act as nations and they have to be dealt with, whether it's by Europeans or by the new republic when it exists, as people you have to conduct diplomacy with. You can't just order around.
Do we know what the Gulf Coast Native American peoples thought of the revolution? Or did they even take notice of the revolution? Because, ostensibly the politics and fighting during the revolution took place between Great Britain and the inhabitants of her 13 colonies. So technically the native peoples of the Gulf Coast fell outside of this territory in dispute.
They did notice the American Revolution, and certainly as it began to be a more global war that pulled in France and then Spain, you could sort of think of it as the closer a native nation was to the British colonies, the more they cared about them. So if somebody like the Cherokees, who has started to have settlers moving onto their lands who are worried about that, they were quicker to act in the American Revolution, to get involved on one side or the other, than people who lived a little bit farther away. So, for example, the Creek Indians, they're just starting to worry at the end of the 18th century about settlers and how the large number of Americans who want their own lands may be dangerous to their lands, to Creek lands. And so within the Creeks, there's a pretty big debate about what to do about this war. Some leaders say we need to strike now, we need to completely side with the British and attack these settlers while we can, while the British are fighting against them. Other Creeks say we need to let them fight it out, let them kill each other, and we'll pick up the pieces when they're gone.
This reminds me of something you said in Independence Lost, where you say that the outcome of the war for independence depended upon the decisions made by Native peoples to either fight or stay home. So I wonder if you would tell us more about Native American thinking during the Revolution. Did Native Americans really want to join this war?
The British needed Native Americans on their side in the war, not so much because they didn't have lots of soldiers, but because they were spread out, especially once the French and the Spanish joined the war. The British needed their Native allies and expected their Indian allies to be sort of the force coming from the West. that if the British Navy can blockade the ports in the Revolution and some number of British troops can be sent, then native allies from the West will help to strangle the colonies and bring them back into line. And that's especially true once the British begin their southern strategy, start to try to take the southern colonies back. They really expect the Creeks and Cherokees and others to come in from the west and be the Western force. But there's a fundamental conflict between the British strategy in the war and most native strategies for the war. So even if you think about Indians who are ready to fight on the side of the British against the colonists, the Indians who want to do that, their reason for doing it is to prevent settlement. They see the British Empire as their best protection against settlers coming onto Indian land. Of course, the British aims in the Revolution are very different from that. They want to put down this rebellion. So first they want to make it stop, make the rebellion stop, but then they want those people, those rebels, back in the empire and unleashing what to many of them are savage military forces against their own people. That's the kind of thing that British officials debated about a lot. Do we bring Indians in on our side, or will that just anger the rebels even more and push them farther away from us, make it more impossible for us to pull them back into the empire? And so Indians want to strike at settlements when they go out to war. They want to only attack rebels who are on their lands, and they don't much care if they're rebelling against the British Crown anyway. What to Indians is the problem is the settlement, the fact that they're on Indian land. Whereas the British want to be very careful about who's rebelling, make sure nobody who's not rebelling gets attacked. They want to push loyalists into the rebel camp. And British officials want Indians to fight when British officials tell them to, at the targets that British officials send them after. And that's not the way Indian warriors or Indian leaders want to fight this war.
You noted that British strategy for the war included the Gulf Coast. Why were the British interested in the Gulf Coast? I mean, it fell outside of the 13 colonies that were in rebellion.
The British would very much have liked the Gulf Coast not to be part of the war, but when the Spanish joined the war, when the Spanish declared war on Britain, immediately it was clear that a new front was going to open up, that Spanish troops were going to come out of New Orleans and attack the British Floridas, the British Gulf Coast, or the other way around, that the British could go on the offensive and try to take Louisiana away from the Spanish. So one of the reminders, I think, that this was a global war, the American Revolution was a war in which empires were also fighting for territory, for sort of in the same ways they had in previous colonial wars in the 18th century, for what the post-war world would look like, how they would divide it up by empire.
So the Gulf Coast was a region of consequence for the British. But was it also a region of consequence for the Patriots? I mean, did the Patriots seek military alliances with the native peoples of the Gulf Coast? Or did they ever try to counter British overtures to them in any way?
So the Gulf Coast was extremely important to the Patriots as they fought their war against Britain. Just having another front there, another place where British troops had to go, or the British had to pay attention to, was important to them. And they hoped that having the Spanish on their side and having Indians in that region, if they could attract them on their side, would just help out their effort against the British. Now, in many ways, because the British expected Indians in the southeast to join them, the Americans mostly just had to try to get those Indians to stay home, to keep them from being part of the war at all. And the war on the Gulf Coast, I think because there hadn't been American settlers moving onto Indian lands there in as large numbers as in other places, it was an easier sell to say, you don't have to fight in this war, stay home, you'll get Spanish goods, Spain will be your ally, and there's no reason to fight on the side of the British.
We know that for the inhabitants of the 13 colonies, the War for Independence proved to be a civil war. Did the war divide and pit members of different Native American communities against each other as well?
Sometimes historians have exaggerated the extent to which the American Revolution caused a civil war in Indian Territory. I think it's because we tend to look toward what happens in the 19th century, the Indian removal, and the extreme difficulties that Indians will have in the 19th century facing U.S. expansion. But in fact, as historians have started to look closer, I think there's a lot of debate within Indian tribes about what to do about this war, but in most cases it stays that way. It's pretty rare that you see people in the American Revolution within one tribe fighting against another people of that tribe. It does happen in a few places. The Oneidas, for example, do end up fighting against other members of the Iroquois Confederacy. But for the most part, the debates are strong. within tribes, and sometimes they're pulled into fighting on one side or the other. But it's not the kind of civil war that you'll see later within some of the tribes as the pressure increases from the Americans in the 19th century.
How did Patriot victory in the War for Independence affect the lives of Native Americans in the Gulf Coast region? I mean, did the Patriots seek out Native Americans who sided with the British for punishment?
At first, it doesn't seem that the American victory is going to matter that much. The British loss may be important as the Spanish begin to move in, the British move out. But the Americans just seem so weak in the 1780s, it doesn't seem likely that they're going to have any influence on the Gulf Coast. It really seems to people who live there that this has been another colonial war, the posts have shifted, Britain's lost some ground, Spain has gained some ground, but things will continue as they have in the past. What, of course, then is the huge surprise of the 1790s and especially the first couple decades of the 19th century is that the United States not only lasts, but is tremendously powerful. And Americans get it in their heads that they have fought a series of wars in order to get Indian land. So they go back to the 7 Years' War and Pontiac's War and the American Revolution itself, and they point to all of those, and they say, with not all that much truth behind it, they say Indians were always on the other side of these wars from us. We fought Indians as well as fighting France and then Britain in order to get Western lands, and therefore we've won them militarily. We deserve them. And they use that as an excuse to push Indians off their lands when the United States does have the power to do that.
So, the purpose of this episode has been to explore just how divisive the Revolution was for Americans. And our quest started by looking at some of the very early histories of the Revolution, where we saw the Revolution interpreted as a nice and neat, tidy affair. But as we've spoken with you and other scholars, we've come to see how, in reality, the Revolution was a messy and complicated event, that it involved many different peoples who had many different experiences. Now, knowing this background, do you have anything you'd like to add from your research that you think we'd benefit from knowing about?
When they created a new country, Americans also needed to have a founding story. And they needed, as nations often do, they needed a simpler founding story than the real circumstances of America's birth. And I like to think of this war, this Revolutionary War, as a colonial war, as a global war, and only in part a rebellion against the crown that creates the United States. Then the creation of that United States leads to this simpler story of that it was the rebellion, it was the revolution that was inevitable and was the only story of this time and place, when in fact there are all these different peoples with all these different agendas, all these different definitions of what the continent should look like, of their own independence or the people's independence. All of those are in conflict at the time of the American Revolution. And it's only later that that story sort of gets papered over into a simple story about a righteous revolution.
Like white Americans and people of African descent, Native Americans had choices to make when it came to the American Revolution. And like whites and people of African descent, Native Americans made choices based on what they felt was in the best interests of their future and their families. And sometimes that choice meant choosing the Patriot or Loyalist side. Often it meant just trying to survive by staying out of the revolution as much as possible. The American Revolution was a divisive civil war, but it was also a series of ideas, events, and opportunities that gave birth to the United States. The first histories of the Revolution, written by contemporary participants like David Ramsey, John Adams, and Mercy Otis Warren, downplay the divisive nature of the Revolution because, as Kathleen reminded us, they were written at a time when the United States' future was so uncertain. Americans in the 1780s, 1790s, and early 1800s needed a simple, more unifying story of the United States' birth so that they could focus on coming together as a people and building the nation's future. And so, the American Revolution was often interpreted as a less complicated event than it really was. This is why episodes in the forthcoming Doing History to the Revolution series will ask not just what is the history of the American Revolution, but what are the histories of the American Revolution? Exploring answers to both questions will really help us discover and develop a more fuller picture of the American Revolution and how the United States came to be. For notes from today's episode, including a detailed bibliography of the writings, books, and articles that inform this episode, visit the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/123. The Omohundro Institute and I intend to produce bonus content for each episode in our new To the Revolution series. For example, each episode will include a detailed bibliography of the work we used to produce the episode. Plus, The OI will make available for free some of the publications it's produced over the last 74 years when they relate to topics of discussion. So you can expect articles from its William and Mary Quarterly and even some chapters from its books. There will also be links and pages with special exhibits, images, and historical sources that you can read for yourself. Now, the best way to access this content is to download the free OI Reader app. It's available for all Android devices and iOS tablets. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/doinghistory for more information about the OI Reader and for a direct link to the app in both the Google Play and Apple App Stores. And if you don't have an Android device or an iOS tablet, send me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, and we'll do our best to get you access to these bonus materials. Doing History is a collaborative effort, and I'm grateful to the Omohundro Institute and its team of scholars and staff members who really helped to make the production of this episode possible. Finally, why do you think it's taken Americans so long to grapple with the Revolution's divisive past? Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.